Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What are some of the major issues confronting India, Brazil, and South Africa? What role does India, as the largest democracy in the world, play in the United Nations Security Council and its peacekeeping operations? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at a very interesting and a very important country and the role it plays at the United Nations and in other venues, and that is India. My guest today is an expert on India. My guest today is Dr. Anupam Ray. From 2008 to 2011, Dr. Ray was deputy head of India's United Nations Security Council team in New York. Dr. Ray returned to the Indian Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi in 2011, serving as deputy coordinator of the 2012 Brics Summit. Mr. Ray is a senior Indian Foreign Service officer currently assigned to the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Ray, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Glad to be here.
I appreciate you being with me today.
Thank you.
India is a critical player, not only at the United Nations, but in many other corners of the world. Let's start off with just an overview of when you were the deputy head of the India's United Nations Security Council delegation. Well, first off, what does the Security Council do generally, and what was your role and the role of India?
The Security Council is a body that was created after World War II to ensure international peace and security. It is basically a reflection of the fact that international problems now require international solutions. No country on its own has the ability anymore to solve, problems arising due to conflict. Conflicts involve many players today. And therefore require many more resources than they used to in the past to be able to solve them. The Charter of the United Nations says that the purpose of the United Nations is to free the world from the scourge of war, and that basically is what the Security Council does. If it's a question of the question is how it spends its time, the output of the Security Council is the documentary output is in terms of resolutions, presidential statements, and other paper and other negotiated outcomes that it produces. And each of these documents is the end product of the application of mind of the Council on a problem. Mm-hmm. It's usually a problem relating to violence somewhere and on how to go about it. The Security Council's output has increased hugely over time. The number of resolutions it produces today, the budgets that it has, the number of people it deploys has increased exponentially. Mm-hmm. India has been on the Council a number of times. We were last on the Council in 2010 to 12. We came on the Council after 20 years. India is one of the first signatories of one of the original signatories of the UN Charter. We strongly believe that the United Nations has a role in solving international disputes and in ensuring international peace and security. Mm-hmm. And we came to the Council with a view to contributing to this process. India has changed enormously in the last 2 or 3 decades. Our economic growth rates have shot up. We are an established democracy. Indian capabilities have increased enormously. And we are, as you know, a candidate to be a permanent member of the Security Council, with wide-ranging support from countries across the world. And we wanted to use this opportunity to demonstrate that the India of today is very different from the India that became free 60 or 70 years ago.
We're going to get into the Security Council composition in just a moment, but before we do that, I think you're absolutely right. It was critical to point out that of the 6 organs of the United Nations, the Security Council is the most powerful, primarily because the resolutions that it adopts are binding on the countries or parties, and secondly, it establishes peacekeeping operations, which are now 16 of them more or less. When you were at the United Nations, what were one or two of the major issues you were dealing with in the Security Council? I know they do a myriad of issues and trouble hotspots and what have you.
The major issues that the Security Council faces, if you analyze how it spends its time again, is that it spends a part of its time on the current crisis. The current crisis when we were there were Libya and Syria. But the major outcome of the way that the Security Council is actually influencing the conduct of international relations is in the manner in which it is trying to shape international law. And this part of the Security Council's work is called thematic work. It's creating new international humanitarian law as it goes along. It's making contributions to the theory of intervention in other states. This is the part of the work of the Security Council that I specifically dealt with during my tenure there.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were talking about the composition. India is, as I mentioned, the largest democracy in the world, second largest country population-wise. There's been a discussion for years and years that many folks are recommending that India become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Right now there are only 5. The Security Council has 15 members, 5 permanent members: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and let's see, China. We don't want to leave China out. And of course, some folks are recommending that India get a permanent seat, that Brazil is the economic engine of Latin America and a large country, get a seat, Japan, a major contributor at the UN, and also Germany, a major participant and contributor. What are the pros and cons, I guess, of let's just say India, we'll just use India as an example, of getting a permanent seat?
I'm glad that that the first part of this question is normally the requirement for UN reform. Why is it, and in particular UN Security Council reform? I'll just take a minute to talk about that. The Security Council was created in 1945. It reflects the geopolitical structure or the concerns of international diplomacy of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And we are today in the 21st century. The 21st century is very different from the 20th century. Firstly, the nature of violence that we saw or the nature of threats to international peace and security that were there when the council was created are very different from what we see today. It's essentially today it's conflict within states as against conflict between states. The possibility of a World War II happening again is remote. You deal with very different threats now. Secondly, there's been a dispersion of economic power, military power, of intellectual capital from across the world at that time. I mean, if you look at the 5 permanent members of the council, at that point, the question of if we accept that this indeed is the case, and that for strengthening the UN it needs more capabilities and more resources and more different output, different inputs. The world today is also very diverse from what it was is much more diverse than what it was when the Security Council was created. There's been the dispersion of the capabilities and economic growth has also created has also created alternative points of view. There are, today India, China are very different from what they were in the 40s, and we have points of view which may differ from what they where it says these need to be reflected in the Security Council, because the Security Council's work needs to have legitimacy in the eyes of the people it affects. And I would argue that adding countries like India adds to the legitimacy of the Security Council's decision. As for India's candidature for the permanent seat, one, of course, is what I said. It adds legitimacy because of its history, because of our role as a leader of the developing world, and our growth, our record as a democracy, our record on issues such as human rights, on inclusive growth in the last few decades. We are also the largest contributor to UN peacekeeping. Now, why is this important? UN peacekeeping is the UN's primary product other than its development operations. And if you look cumulatively at the amount of resources or time that the UN has spent on its various enterprises, peacekeeping would be a major output, would be in fact the predominant output. And in that, India has been the largest contributor by a very far margin to peacekeeping. So we are, in a sense, one of the biggest contributors to the UN's efforts in the world. And I think that deserves recognition.
Exactly, it certainly is. And as I think back, I think it was Security Council Resolution 1325, I'm not sure of that number, but that was the one that wanted to involve more women in the United Nations because it pretty much had been a male club for so many years, but to bring women in to help achieve the UN Millennium Development Goal number 3, to empower women. And one of the ways they did it was through bringing female peacekeepers. And as I recall, the first female delegation or first female police mission went to Liberia, and it was Indian peacekeepers, which was really quite a tribute to India, obviously, to put that much faith in bringing a group in for the first time ever and putting them in Liberia. I'm sure you folks, everyone was very proud of that.
Yes, we are very proud of that because, firstly, it reflects well on the emphasis that we have placed on on elevating the status of women in India in the last 50 or 60 centuries. It's a reflection of how important it is for us, even in our international policies, to elevate women to their due status. It's also a reflection of the fact that India has the capabilities that the UN requires in situations like Liberia and Congo. We have lived through these experiences, and we have overcome some of them, and we have those capabilities that these nations and the United Nations need. When the international community is looking for expertise on situations on say weak states, or in situations where development and conflict have to be managed simultaneously, where development, conflict, and a rule of law have to be introduced simultaneously. I don't think that there is any other country which has the experience and the capabilities that India has. We can put, as you pointed out, women, the rights of women, what the role of women is a very important indicator of development, of rule of law, of whether rule of law is prevalent or not, whether democracy prevails or not. And our record in this helps focus attention to these issues, and also to help those countries develop their capabilities in these areas.
Now, you were on the inside, you saw the United Nations from a very unique perspective. As you look at the United Nations, and you can pick any area you would like, with the UN the way it is today, is there some recommendation as to what do you perceive as maybe the major challenge confronting the UN over and above financing? That's always a problem. There are cutbacks taking place at the UN and in so many other entities around the world. But what do you see as sort of the major challenge to the UN today? And do you have a recommendation on what the UN can do to be more effective in the future in whatever area you might want to focus?
Yes, the United Nations is, in a way, a victim of its success. I would like to place on record that my view that the United Nations is a successful organization. It has achieved, it has done enormous good. The biggest challenge that it faces is changing its procedures and its structures to reflect the world of today. As I said earlier, the United Nations and its structures represents the geopolitical realities of 1945. The geopolitical realities, the economic realities, the social realities today are very different. There is, to make a point that I made earlier today, an enormous dispersion of economic ability, of military ability, of of all kinds of abilities, and this needs to be reflected in structures such as the UN Security Council. Secondly, the UN must also find a way of reconciling or of absorbing the divergent views that are being put on the table, that the rise of say the global East and the global South has created. There is a tendency to push certain norms as orthodoxies, and this needs to be adjusted to accommodate other viewpoints. It must be where people talk to each other, not people talking down to each other or talking across each other. This must be a place where people form viewpoints. The UN's legitimacy is unique. My fear is that if the UN is unable to absorb these differing viewpoints, its position in global governance will be supplanted by other organizations. The idea of global governance is here to stay. Now the question is whether the UN will retain the preeminent position in this structure or not, and we must all ensure that it does.
Exactly. And as you mentioned, global governance is not one world government. That's totally different, but you're right. It's bringing the players together to carry out the programs and to do so effectively. There are many foreign policy observers who look at the UN and say they would agree with you that the UN has been successful, even with its limitations today. There are problems at the UN. Undoubtedly, you have 193 members of the UN General Assembly, the Board of Directors, but the UN has, a lot of these folks will argue, has saved the world from World War III, because we look at the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We were just ready to start launching missiles at one another, which would have wiped out the world as we know it today. You look at so many other close calls the world has had over the years, and you look at the whole family of the UN, the agencies that are there to help move ships, mail, airplanes, weather information around the globe peacefully and safely, and those are absolutely critical to a high-tech world within which we live. So a lot of people, even with the limitations of the UN, the warts and imperfections, the UN has been very successful in many areas and can be more successful in the future. Well, in the opening I mentioned Brics. First I'll mention Brazil, India, and South Africa. Let's talk about the Brics first. What does Brics stand for? You were the deputy coordinator in 2012 of Brics Summit. What does the Brics stand for, and what was the summit about?
This is a very interesting concept in some ways. The word brick was actually first coined by Goldman Sachs. It was coined in a report sometime in the early 2000s by an analyst in Goldman Sachs who looked at world output as it was economic output as it was evolving, and pointed out that the major growth in the world is actually taking place in four emerging economies: Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and that's how BRIC came. So that's BRIC, and South Africa joined later, and it was called BRICS. This is one area where the governments played catch up with the private sector, and BRICS leaders started interacting on a formal basis, on a structured basis, about I think 5 or 6 years after this report came out. BRICS is essentially a reflection of what I told you earlier, that there's a dispersion of global capabilities. And when people acquire capabilities, they tend to talk with each other. So this is a group of nations which has similar interests in some areas, has similar concerns in other areas, is following similar economic trajectories, and would like to play a constructive role in global affairs, would like to coordinate positions. BRICS heads of government, foreign ministers meet on a regular basis. And over a period of time, the convergences have led to creation of institutions. The last institution that was created was the New Development Bank, or the BRICS Development Bank. That was a decision to create, which was taken a couple of months ago.
Now, that New Development Bank, that is a parallel institution like to the World Bank. How do you see that functioning? Will that be sort of a rival to the World Bank, or will they work together on projects, or will some of the other developing countries come to the New Development Bank that was just created by BRICS?
the World Bank, the IMF, and the United Nations were essentially created out of an intellectual movement which is often referred to as Bretton Woods. They're referred to as Bretton Woods institutions. They reflected, again, to drive home the same point that I made earlier, they reflected the realities of the world, the way the world thought the problem should be approached at the end of World War II. That time has gone by. The IMF and the World Bank have a certain decision-making structure, have a certain orientation and a certain focus, which many developing countries like India do not entirely agree with. On the whole, we agree that their force is for good, but we feel that they could possibly perform better. They need to be more representative. And there is also an alternative view of about development. Development economics or development administration came up at about this time, at about the time the World Bank and the IMF came up. The idea was to promote global economic convergence and to bring up the standards of living in developing countries. Now that has occurred. It has occurred in many of these countries due to methods and due to the resources of these countries. And this has spawned this whole field of South-South cooperation. We sometimes are able to understand and relate to other countries that have a similar experience and similar requirements as us. And the Brics Development Bank is in a way answers both these imperatives. The first is the need for a more representative global system, the importance of and the need for a more representative financial system in the world, and of the importance of cooperation amongst the global South, the countries which were earlier not so developed or so rich.
And the landscape is changing.
Correct.
They are improving immensely. Yes. We were talking about Brics, but prior to that, I guess Brics is about 7 years old as a group, but going back about 10 years back, we have another group that started as part of the Brics, but prior to that, it was India, China, and Brazil. I guess it was the BIC part of the Brics. Were those the three countries that got together to focus on some of these issues?
Well, there are all kinds of groupings actually, but there is a grouping which has Brazil, India, and China. But I think what you're probably referring to is India, Brazil, and South Africa. It's called
India, Brazil. My mistake.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's called IBSA because India, Brazil, and South Africa are all a part of Brics. Yes, we have this grouping called India, Brazil, South Africa. It predates Brics by about 3 or 4 years. These are all developing countries which are in 3 different continents, in Asia, in Africa, and in South America, with similar interests, similar economic trajectories, similar concerns on global governance. The heads of state, the governments meet together on a regular basis, interact on a regular basis. They have created an IBSA fund for poverty alleviation, which actually implements projects in third countries and has done very innovative work. It's administered by the UNDP, but this is also an example of how the newer countries or the newer economic entities can operate in cooperation with existing economic entities. The regular communiques are issued whenever these leaders meet, and you will see that the communiques list the areas of common concern: global governance, the Millennium Development Goals, human rights, climate change, world trade, the Doha Development Round, and so on.
Exactly. And our viewers can Google all of these issues and Google Brics.
Yes.
They can Google
Yes.
IBSA. They can do all that and get to the point. But in the last couple of seconds we have left, how do you view the world today as far as what do you see as one of the major issues that the countries of the world will be confronting, India, the United States, other countries, and especially the United Nations, possibly through the UN? Is there one particular issue that's out there looming?
The United Nations works on a certain compact or a certain understanding. The understanding or the belief is that as the charter says, that the scourge of war has to be removed by economic development and by nations talking to each other. Roosevelt made that famous speech about the freedom from fear and the freedom from want, And the underlying assumption is that the freedom from fear and freedom from want will move the world in a particular direction. What we see today is that the removal of these fears does not lead to a convergence of thought, essentially. That the removal of freedom from fear and want actually sometimes results in ideologies which countries like India and the United States are not comfortable with. All right-thinking countries in the world believe in the right things: freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of faith, of the development of women, to empowering minorities and so on. But there are ideologies today which are using the resources that are available, which are against these, and we need to have a way of dealing with this.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Anupam Ray, the Senior Indian Foreign Service Officer, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Glad to be here.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.